So I apologise in advance. I've got a stinking cold, so I sound a little bit croaky. But I thought I would just put this together because I've been delivering a little bit of general damp and mould training to some Scottish landlords, and it's given me the opportunity to look at how Awaab's law is being implemented. When I started delivering the training, we didn't have the draft legislation. But it has now come out, so it's given me an opportunity to have a look through it. So hopefully you find this useful if you are a Scottish landlord or you do any surveying or expert work, perhaps across the border, or a mix of both. So it's set to come in place in October 2026, and it's going to apply to both private and social landlords. Although there's some similarities, there's also quite a lot of differences between the English version. Its name, for a start, is slightly different. So in Scotland, it's going to be called the Investigation and Commencement of Repair Scotland Regulations 2026. So I'll start with this. Similarly to when it was due to come into place in England, there was a lot of rumour, there was a lot of misinformation, there was a lot of guesswork, and it made it really difficult for social housing providers to start preparing for its implementation because it does take a long time for those kind of wheels to get in motion. And we're seeing the same sort of thing. If you go onto Google and tap in Awaab's Law Scotland, you end up first of all with this AI summary. And right down at the bottom, for example, it says emergency hazards. The rules mandate that hazards posing an immediate risk to health be investigated and mitigated within 24 hours under Awaab's law. So that's the first thing that's not quite right in terms of the legislation, that we can already see the draft legislation. So what we've actually got coming into place is this. We've got 10 working days to carry out an investigation, 3 working days from the conclusion of that investigation to provide a written update to tenants, and then 5 working days to start works. Landlords will then have up to 20 working days to complete those works. This is quite different to the English version. First of all, there's no emergency inspection and there is no emergency repair. Secondly, in the English version, it's up to 12 weeks to complete the works, whereas this is brought down to 20 days in the Scottish version. Another significant difference between the English and the Scottish legislation is the wording. So, in English legislation, it is that homes must be free from emergency hazards or significant hazards, and if not, those timescales kick in. In the Scottish legislation, the obligation is to ensure that the house is substantially free from damp and mould and to investigate and carry out repairs in relation to damp and mould. So, again, in the same way as there's some ambiguity in the English legislation, it's going to be the same in Scotland, and there's going to be some level of interpretation. The only thing that there is in some areas in existing Scottish legislation is things like there must be mechanical ventilation in kitchens or bathrooms if there is more than 5% visible dampness or mould in those rooms. And I actually think this wording is probably going to be easier for Scottish landlords to deal with because it takes away that emergency significant hazard, the having to make an assessment of health impact without being medically trained. It's really just about what can we see and is it substantially free from damp and mould or is it not? And I think especially when it comes to mould, that's probably going to be more critical to making sure that landlords have good processes and tenants have better rights. So, in terms of how it's legally going to be implemented, in England, Awaab's law came in as an amendment to existing legislation. So, it's an amendment to the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, and it's got a whole new section. And the section is called Section 10A, and it sits in between the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act changes and the pre existing Section 11 general repairing obligations. In Scotland, there's a couple of legislative and regulatory changes. The first one is a small amendment to the Housing Act 2006, and these are some tweaks to the wording in sections 13 and 14. But the most significant difference, and one that I really like, is that they've used it primarily to amend the right to repair regulations, which is a regulation in Scotland, and there's a really similar regulation in England. This sits really well, in my opinion, because Awaab's law is about timescales and the right to repair regulations is about timescales. So I really like that change, and it's worth looking into this to find out a little bit more. So firstly, in terms of the wording that's changed to the Housing Act, it defines that a competent person, so the person carrying out any sort of investigation, means a person who, in the reasonable opinion of the landlord, has the skills and experience necessary to determine whether a qualifying repair is required in relation to this new regulation. It then says that the regulation applies where a tenant notifies a landlord or the landlord otherwise becomes aware that the tenant's house is or may be affected by damp and mould. The landlord then must ensure that an investigation is completed by a competent person within that 10 working day period, beginning with the day after the day on which the landlord is notified or otherwise becomes aware of the damp and mould, to determine whether a qualifying repair is required. At this point, like with Awaab's law in Scotland, the landlord must give the tenant a written summary of the results of the investigation within 3 working days, and that begins with the day after the day on which the investigation is completed. And then if the investigation identifies that a qualifying repair is required, the landlord must ensure that the qualifying repair is commenced by the primary contractor within a period of 5 working days, and that begins the day after the day on which the investigation is completed. So that is a little bit staggered. We've got a few days in between that could elongate it, but hopefully landlords would be a little bit more responsive than that. The definition of a qualifying repair are those that are on the list set out within the right to repair regulations. And then the landlord must ensure that following a qualifying repair, the house must then be substantially free from damp and mould, and so far as is reasonably practicable, the house will continue to be substantially free from damp and mould. So similar to Awaab's law in England, there will be cases where there is some sort of damp and mould, but it's not deemed to be substantial. In these cases, it doesn't mean that it's not a landlord's responsibility. It just means that it's outside of the scope of these Awaab's law regulations, and it still needs action, it still needs investigation, it might need repairs, improvements, or it might need a little bit of an education piece. And in that case, it will be sitting within those routine timescales. But again, proactive landlords will try and deal with everything as soon as they possibly and practicably can. But what I'm going to show you now is I've got 2 timelines or 2 examples, both of which are going to be compliant with the new kind of timescales set out in Awaab's law. The first one, landlord A, they are on notice, they're put on notice of a damp or mould issue. We've got 2 examples here, but we're going to treat them both the same. One's damp, one's mould. In this case, the landlord is going to ensure that a competent person looks at this. But in this case, they've provided upskilling to all of their staff, including housing officers, call centres. So this competent person is able to, over the phone, perhaps by looking at emails, some photos that have been sent in, they're going to be able to look at it and determine the most likely cause. So in the top example, they're going to ask all the right questions to figure out that there's a roof above, there's no plumbing. So they're determining that this is therefore a qualifying repair because it's a roof leak and it needs to be arranged now within 5 working days, and they're just going to book that in. And on day 0, they're also going to send that written update to say, thanks for letting me know, this is what we're doing, this is when it's going to be done by, everything else that they need to tell the tenant. If it was the example at the bottom, they're going to look at that, they're going to ask all the right questions, and then what they're going to do is they're going to provide guidance about furniture placement, but they're also going to ask questions about mechanical ventilation, window trickle vents, heating, and if they can identify any defect that might be contributing towards this, they're going to arrange that straight away. So if it's a qualifying repair, that will be arranged somewhere between day 1 and 5. If there's no obvious defect, then what they'll probably be doing anyway is arranging for a further investigation just to make sure there's nothing else going on in the property. And this is really great customer service. Tenants are going to be much happier with this approach. If we look at landlord B, what they're going to do is day 0, they're going to be put on notice of some sort of damp or mould issue. Again, same examples, and they're going to arrange for an investigation without asking any of those questions over the phone or through emails. And then that investigation is going to be carried out on day 10 by a competent person, possibly in the home. They're going to identify whether or not there's a qualifying repair. The tenant will then receive a written update, maybe 3 days later, and then day 11 to day 16, the qualifying repair is going to be arranged and or that advice, education, support is going to be provided. So we can see there's a massive difference now between potentially resolving things on day 1 to perhaps it being day 11 to day 16. And that's going to be a massive difference when it comes to overall resident satisfaction and complaints and general issues between landlords and tenants. So that's what landlords are going to have to focus on if they're going to get this right, is making sure that they're not just meeting the legislation, but trying to exceed it where possible and trying to give the best possible service to tenants. So before I go on to my final points about timescales and compensation, just to highlight exactly the same in English law, really, really important to make sure that everyone's aware that Awaab's law doesn't change any of the existing legislation, as in take away anyone's rights. So in Scottish law, there's a couple of key acts and regulations. We've already talked about the right to repair, but there's the Housing Act in Scotland, the Tolerable Standard, and also the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. Looking at the Housing Act, landlords already, before Awaab's law, had a responsibility in Scotland to ensure that the house is wind and watertight and in all other respects reasonably fit for human habitation at the start of and throughout tenancy. Right to repair sets out those list of small urgent repairs to be completed within fixed timescales. The Scottish Housing Quality Standard says that landlords need to ensure that properties are safe, secure, and free from serious disrepair. And landlords need to ensure that properties meet the tolerable standard as a minimum, which includes requirements for structural stability, safe electricity and gas, and freedom from damp. That was already there. So it's Awaab's law that brings in this new, slightly different wording, which is to ensure that the house is substantially free from damp and mould and to investigate and commence repairs in relation to damp and mould within those set timescales. So if we take a look at those timescales that are already in legislation and they're highlighted in Awaab's law as these kind of prescribed repairs, we've got within 1 working day, Scottish landlords need to resolve all of these following issues. So it includes significant leaks or flooding from pipes, tanks, cisterns, blocked or leaking foul drains, soil stacks, toilet pans, loss or partial loss of gas supply, loss or partial loss of space or water heating where no alternative heating is available. And then within 7 working days to resolve a mechanical extractor fan not working in an internal bathroom or kitchen. But then outside of the right to repair regulations, there are going to be other repairs. So things like roof leaks, wet cavity wall insulation, drainage leaks, overflowing gutters, no mechanical ventilation, insufficient insulation, defective pointing, render, and lots more. With the ones in red, they're really straightforward because if you meet the right to repair obligations, then you're by default going to meet your obligations under Awaab's law. With all these other ones, they've typically, or up until Awaab's law, they had timescales of something like 7 working days or routine. Those timescales might well still be in place, but if, as a result of those defects, you deem that the property is then not substantially free from damp or mould, the timescale then comes forward to that 5 working days. So that's the difference that it's going to make to the existing legislation. The legislation does also include this bit, which says that if, due to circumstances beyond the control of the landlord, they're unable to comply with the duty imposed on them, they must give notice to the tenant specifying that they're unable to comply, the reason why, and the period within which they consider that they will be able to comply with the duty. But in the meantime, the landlord must consider any reasonable steps that should be taken where practicable to minimise the extent to which the house is affected by damp or mould. The legislation also says that where a tenant fails to provide access to a house for the purpose of enabling the qualifying repair to be inspected or carried out, although that tenant has been given a reasonable opportunity to do so, the procedure shall be cancelled and the provisions of Regulations 10 and 13 shall cease to apply. But of course, landlords should still be endeavouring to get access and considering injunctions, especially if there's a risk to the property or to people in the home. Now's probably a good time to point out that unlike in English law, there's not a lot of provision or anything expressly written into Scottish legislation that sets out exactly what tenant obligations are. So this is where it will be really important for social landlords and private landlords to have it really clearly but fairly written into the tenancy agreement, so that there's a contractual obligation to use the property in a tenant-like manner. So this final bit is right to repair essentials and best practice. This isn't necessarily new. There's only a couple of slightly different bits here with Awaab's law. So a landlord must let its tenants know in writing once every year about the provisions of the right to repair regulations, including a list of contractors prepared to carry out qualifying repairs. The second part of this is that in respect of any single qualifying repair in that list of right to repair, the landlord shall pay for the workers carried out up to a maximum of £350. So that's the value of the maximum value of any repair for it to be a qualifying repair. The third point of this is that where a landlord fails to carry out a qualifying repair or fails to carry out an investigation under Awaab's law within the agreed timescales, then the landlord shall pay the tenant a sum of compensation calculated as below. So the compensation calculation is this. It is £15 plus £3 for every working day after the maximum period that it should have been completed. And it ends on the day on which the qualifying repair is completed, subject to a maximum amount of compensation of £100. So this is dealt with very differently from landlord to landlord in my experience. In some cases, tenants don't know about these rights, maybe they're not being informed of it. Even if you write to tenants, are they really going to read it? Do they really understand it? In many cases, this compensation isn't paid until there's a complaint. And at that point, it's far too late. Ideally, all people working for landlords, especially those in frontline services, so call centres, customer service, should know this, and it should ideally be built into systems, because when you're booking a repair or cancelling a repair or rearranging a repair, the system should be able to flag this is out of target. And as soon as it's out of target, that's an opportunity to remind a tenant of what their rights were and to say, we're really sorry, this is going to be 3 days late, this is going to be 5 days late, this is what we're doing in the meantime, but you are entitled, and we're really sorry this has gone wrong. We really appreciate your patience. You are entitled to X amount of pounds in compensation. Would you like us to pay that directly to you, or would you like us to add it to your rent account? And if it gets delayed any longer, please get back in touch with us if we forget to do that, because you may be entitled to further compensation. Is there anything else we can do to make it right? These are the temporary repairs that we might be able to carry out. Are there any other vulnerability considerations that we need to give you? And that is how you're going to maintain a positive relationship with residents, is people not having to ask for compensation, but you just being able to recognise it and apologise at that really early stage. And that's so important. And tenant feedback again and again will say very often it's not about the delay, it's about the lack of communication, and it's the lack of ownership and accountability from my landlord. So when times are hard, when maybe resources are a little bit short, it's that communication. And that's what Awaab's law is bringing in. That's its main intention. It's what's great about it. But landlords really need to build it into their process and build in that what if things go wrong? Because things will go wrong. It's how you deal with it that makes the big difference. So final points here for Scottish landlords to start thinking about. First one is, what does substantially free mean? This isn't going to be an easy one. It's not going to be handed on a plate. This is going to take good, consistent, evidence-based risk assessment, and it needs to be applied fairly and consistently across all tenants who are reporting issues with damp and mould. The second is, who is a competent person? Again, it's not expressly stated. It doesn't say this is what the qualification is going to be, this is what their job role is going to be. Training is going to be really, really important, because upskilling frontline teams isn't about shortchanging tenants. Sometimes a qualified surveyor is going to be needed, but sometimes an upskilled frontline member of the team will be able to support residents to get the quickest, most appropriate response. Training is going to be such a key part of that, and hopefully some of the Scottish landlords that I've been doing this training with will, be able to explain how that has helped and just provide this more holistic approach. The third one is whether the £350 limit applies to damp and mould related risks. Again, some debate here. You're going to have to make your own decision unless it's clarified elsewhere. And then the final point, it's not directly related to any of this, but it's a really important question to think about, which is how to safely treat mould. There's lots of discussion about this now in England, and it's going to carry on. It's going to carry on being a discussion until more prescriptive guidance is out there. We've got really clear British standards for how to safely remediate flood damage. But when it comes to humidity and condensation related mould, the guidance is much, much less clear. So I know already that lots and lots of social housing providers are moving away from some of the really, really harsh chemicals because of the potential risks, or even just discomfort to the people using the treatment and the people living in the homes, moving over to some slightly less chemical based, but possibly still biocide, fungicidal based. But there's also an argument based on some of the existing guidance, not specific to humidity and condensation related mould, that you could use HEPA filter vacuums and detergent based. So again, now is the time. You've got a few months to start thinking about this and put in a really, really clear process for investigation, process for determining whether it's substantially free, upskilling all teams because anyone could be put on notice and has an opportunity to keep residents safe. And then finally having a really clear risk assessment and method statement, even if it's a split one, that you've got an option for one, which would be tenants or operatives who are sensitive to mould, sensitive to some of those harsher chemicals, those who don't want any biocides in their property or to be using it, and then another for residents who would like biocide or fungicidal treatment for that peace of mind. And likewise for operatives, it's got to be a conversation. There's got to be some element of choice. We can't just be going into people's homes and doing things that make them feel unsafe, even if it's done for the right reasons. So hopefully that makes sense. I know that's a pretty long presentation, but we know from how it was implemented in Awaab's law that there was a lot of misinformation. So hopefully that will help. And what I'll try and do is put together a little bit of a briefer guide, perhaps just a few pages summarising some of those key bits. But hopefully you found it useful. And if anyone disagrees, I'd also be really interested to know, because there's going to be so much interpretation. So anything that anyone else has spotted, do share, do comment, like it, all of that sort of stuff, just to get the word out there if you think that it is useful. And I have kind of been able to interpret this with some level of accuracy.